Hello and welcome to a Heritage University exclusive Stormwater Management. If we have not had the chance to meet before, my name is Melissa Rogers and I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Heritage Property Management. Tonight, I will be joined by Paul Slavinsky of Aquascape Environmental, and he will be reviewing the difference between retention and detention ponds, as well as all things stormwater management related. Each of you are free to submit questions in the Q&A section, which is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, but please don't hesitate to submit your questions along the way. If this is your first time attending a Heritage training class, welcome. We are so glad that you've joined us this evening. Heritage University offers a number of classes throughout the year, and you can find our schedule by visiting www.heritageproperty.com and selecting homeowner resources. Each of you attending tonight's class will get a full copy of the recording as well as any additional items and questions for the presentation. So let's start our fun, and I now introduce you to Paul.
Thank you, Melissa. Glad everybody could be here this evening. As Melissa said, I'm Paul Slavinsky with Aquascape Environmental. A little bit about ourselves. We're an aquatic resource management company. We like to say we kind of handle everything water related when it becomes surface water or natural water systems, whether they be natural ponds, streams, and with tonight's topic, stormwater management. I'm Vice President of Operations with Aquascape, which means I wear a lot of hats, but my specific area of expertise is stormwater management. I've been with Aquascape 23, going on 24 years. So I haven't seen it all when it comes to stormwater management, but we've seen a lot of crazy stuff, especially when you're dealing with the Atlanta metro area. So tonight's talk about stormwater management, like Melissa said, in the past, we've done the differences of retention versus detention ponds because there's a lot of confusion with that, and they're the most common types of stormwater practices. What we've changed a little bit about this class and talk is we're going to kind of take it from where a lot of y'all get involved. There's a lot of and a lot of times it just starts with your first contact with an inspector or some regulatory agency. So we'll go from there. Josh, if you can go to the next slide, please. Go on to the next one. So stormwater BMPs, or best management practices, as they say. We'll kind of start off with a little snippet on what is stormwater. It all comes back to the Clean Water Act, and basically stormwater infrastructure is meant to treat runoff, like today where it's raining at our office now, and it's supposed to mimic the natural landscape in response to urbanization. So in a nutshell, if you have 15 acres of forest, once they put up a neighborhood, now you're dealing with a bunch of impervious surfaces with roadways, driveways, roofs, no longer having trees. Now you got turf grasses. Those stormwater infrastructure by law has to mimic the runoff as if the trees were still there. So if you had X number of cubic foot per second of runoff for a given storm event, you would have the same, and that's achieved by putting in stormwater, in the most commonly stormwater retention or detention ponds. There's a lot of confusion when it goes that. There's a lot of engineering and hydrology that goes into those ponds. They don't just kind of throw them up. Those outlet control structures are engineered, and the size of the orifices are all to mimic that runoff. So next slide, please. If you really want to get into it, as with everything government oriented, there is the official, they call it the Blue Book, the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual. There are several volumes, and you're looking at well in the excess of 800 pages. It will spell out everything you would ever want to know and probably don't want to know about stormwater management. That's where it helps having a professional come in and assist you with this process, because that's kind of what they do and we do is we know the ins and out of that process, and you don't have to go kind of figure it out for yourself. Next slide, please. So like I said, we're going to take it from the start of the process. This is a very common letter. Like you see at the top, it says notice to comply. This is Gwinnett County's standard letter. They will send it to the responsible party. That may be you as a private homeowner. That may be your management company that oversees the HOA practices for an entire community. If you are a commercial property owner, it may go to the owner of that building, even though that you're, renting or leasing that building, or it may go to you as the tenant itself. But this notice to comply basically says that someone from the county has come out. There is some manner of either deficiency or notification, and they need you to address those deficiencies to bring the stormwater practices up to compliance. Next slide, please. If you're lucky, you get one of these, which is a inspection form. This one's kind of basic. There's not a lot to this one, but that would mean that the county or the city or the regulatory agency has inspected that stormwater practice for you. And it gives you a breakdown of the deficiencies and what needs to be fixed. In a lot of cases, they don't provide this to you. They just say, we do not have records of an inspection. We need you to provide that to us. When it comes to stormwater inspections from a EPA type law with the Clean Water Act, the counties are only required to inspect or check up on their stormwater infrastructure on a specific recurring basis. So like we used to do all of the stormwater inspections for the city of Brookhaven. Well, it's not feasible or reasonable to inspect every single pond and stormwater feature in a city, even the size of just Brookhaven, in 1 year. So the way the law is written is you only have to inspect it 20% of the infrastructure per year. So if we came out to inspect it, or the city came out and inspected this year, you wouldn't see them again for 5 years. So in a lot of cases, as anybody knows, a lot can happen in those 5 years. Next slide, please. Like we said, unfortunately, a lot of municipalities, this one is for the city of Atlanta, they are putting most of the onus for these inspections on you. So the letter on this one here, which is from City of Atlanta Department of Watershed, basically says, we know you have a stormwater feature on your property or multiple ones. We do not have records of inspections that you have performed or maintenance that you have performed, and we need you to respond to us in a given amount of time and bring that stuff current and up to date. Now, with a lot of these, where a lot of people get scared is we call it kind of shock and awe. On almost all of them, there's a deadline down there, whether it's 10 days, some of them are 30 days, but almost all of them put in there, if we don't hear from you, you could get fines and all that. It's basically to get the ball moving. Most of those deadlines are kind of just guidelines. If you respond back to them and say, hey, we're working on it, they're not going to hold you tried and true to that. They're willing to work with you. Everybody has maintenance and repair issues that they have to bring up to snuff. So they know you can't just jump on it. Like even contractors like us right now, it's raining outside today. Most of our crews, if we got a new job today, it'd be at least a month before they could get out there, unless it's on an emergency basis, just because, you know, they've got so much work that they're trying to tackle. Next slide, please. Again, this is City of Atlanta's. This is the list of stuff that they need from you. If you're a new property manager or new to the HOA, this is actually a good list to kind of look at of stuff that you want to kind of keep in your records. One of the biggest things that we really recommend people have, and it is on this list, is the design plans for your community. You know, those are required to be submitted into the county. If you can get a copy, it is best, but basically, you know, it shows where the roads are, where the land lots are, but it also shows all the infrastructure. So it will show where stormwater features are on the property, whether they be underground features or surface retention and detention ponds, and it'll show what those are intended to be. You know, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but, you know, there's a big difference between a retention pond and a detention pond. Well, that will show on the plans, and ultimately, when you have an inspector come out, you know, from a regulatory agency, they're going to hold you to what the plans say are supposed to be there. So you want to make sure that, you know, when you, especially on new communities, when you take over, that what is on the plans is what is actually out there. Next slide, please. So again, here's, I guess I could jump a little ahead, but here's a set of plans. This is the stormwater sheet for this community. You can see it's only, you know, a certain phase probably of this community. You're looking at maybe 20 homes. If you look in the upper center, you can see where it says detention pond. That's giving you the type of stormwater structure that is. Down in the kind of open center right of those set of plans shows the outlet control structure. So it shows the specific engineering of the size of the orifices for that pond, what elevations they're supposed to be at, and all the engineering that goes into it to make it actually function and handle the stormwater like it's intended to. Next slide, please. So getting to the nuts and bolts of it, where we said it's very important. These are the two most common stormwater features that we deal with anywhere. And they are detention ponds, retention ponds, and unfortunately, a lot of people use them the terms synonymously. But they're very different. A detention pond, like it says in the slide, if it's a D, if you can remember the D, it is meant to be dry. That means after a storm event like we had at the office today, within 24 to 48 hours, that pond should drain dry again. A retention pond is always going to have water in it to some certain elevation, except maybe in extreme droughts, but it will always have water in it. Now, the thing of it is you can see in the slide, both of these have concrete dams. You know, both of them have fences around it and all that, and concrete outlet control structures. So they look very similar, but the intentions of them are drastically different. Next slide, please. We said here, the two most common are detention and retention pond, but we listed a few more here that just kind of shows you that the inspection process, having a professional come out and inspect your stuff, it's not always just surface ponds. That's what, you know, is front and center, and a lot of people see those because they take up a lot of real estate in communities. But, you know, you've got underground detention vaults, which are really big inside the perimeter in Atlanta. Hydrodynamic pre-treatment filters, those are becoming pretty prevalent. You know, stormwater baffle filters, you know, bioretention, green roofs, all kinds of low impact development type stormwater infrastructure. So having a professional that can come out, and even if you don't have a set of plans, they can come out and walk and assess your community and really kind of do, for lack of a better word, a bit of sleuthing and kind of follow the water and follow the gradients, and they'll find most of this stuff for you. Next slide, please. Like I said, be cognizant that there might not only be one structure that you're having to deal with. This is one building that is a customer for us, and it's a commercial property, and this one building has 3 large detention ponds because it's a massive warehouse. It's a little hard to see in the Google Earth there, but I mean, this is a big manufacturing type facility. And so you have 3 detention ponds. We're all in close proximity all around the perimeter, but all 3 of those would have to be inspected separately and made sure that they're functioning properly to avoid any issues with, stormwater backups or non-compliance with the regulatory community. Next slide, please. Like we said, having a professional being able to look at this, these are becoming more and more prevalent. When space is limited, they put a lot of these things underground. There is some different nuances and stuff to the underground things, but really at the bare root of it, if it's an underground detention pond or a surface detention pond, they're the exact same. One just happens to be underneath a parking deck or in a, underneath a building, sometimes underneath a roadway, but it serves the same function and they are the same entity that a surface pond is, but they're just saving space. So next slide, please. They have kind of their own complications for underground stuff. As you can see, this one here, this is the only way in and out of the underground vault. It's a detention pond. As you can see, the weir structure there in the middle, that's the outlet control structure for it. So when you go in the access there, but any maintenance and stuff all has to go through this manhole. So like we said, has its own complications. And unfortunately, in case of these, like underground, out of sight, out of mind. If you're not inspecting these regularly, some bad things can happen because water backs up and people don't know about it until all of a sudden it's just flowing out into the roadways and whatnot. Next slide, please. Here's a view inside of that same underground. It being the one that inspects this one, this is the size of a football field underneath 2 buildings in downtown Atlanta. It's a massive concrete structure, but at the root of it, it is just a detention pond. The same as a detention pond that would be up on the surface. They just have it underground underneath their buildings to save space. It's the only usable space they have. Next slide, please. So step 2, whether it is a regulatory agency or a private consultant like us, the way it's written in the Blue Book, you should be having a formal annual inspection of your stormwater features on an annual basis. You should look at them, preferably more often than that. The book says you should visually look at them after every rain event, but that's a lot to put on your HOA president or even a building owner. Again, a lot of times these are pushed off to remote portions of a property. Getting down into them and looking at them every single rain event doesn't necessarily happen, but we really recommend, if nothing else, a once a year formal annual inspection of them. And basically what that will produce is, this is again an example. You'll see a lot of Gwinnett County stuff in here. They've been on kind of the forefront. They really jumped on this early. So this is in one of their inspection forms, but this form, it comes from the Blue Book. So you'll see a lot of similar versions of it that everybody kind of has their own little interpretation on it and how it best works for them. So, but it lists all the features of in this case is a detention pond, a dry pond, and you can see it has 4 or 5 little X marks on certain line items, and basically that's where a deficiency was noted for that pond. It may be a routine maintenance type deficiency, or it may be a immediate, hey, you got to get out there now. A lot of times they'll have notes out to the side or at the bottom that kind of outlines what each of one of those are. And then usually a bit of a photo documentation so that you can go out and kind of see what they were seeing when they came out there. Like it says off to the left there, if it's a municipality that's coming to inspect these, if they can't get into the pond, whether it be locked or so overgrown, if you wouldn't go in there, they're probably not going to go in there. And they're just going to send you a notice to comply and say, hey, you need to clear it so that we can get in there and do a proper inspection. And then we'll come back and do a proper inspection. You know, it's kind of adding steps to the process, if you will. You get a violation that they can't get in there, you'll clean it up and clear it so that they can get in there. And then they're going to come up and give you another list of things more than likely that are deficient with the pond. And then the contract, you have to pay for a contract to come out again. So having them inspected on an annual basis, even on your own, tends to avoid that process. Next slide, please. So common detention pond, dry pond, a lot of times, like I said, it's behind that privacy fence off in the far corner of a neighborhood or even a commercial property. A lot of times they look like this. Next slide, please. This is the exact same pond after it was maintained after an inspection by the regulatory agency. This is how they want to see it. It's cleared of nuisance vegetation. All the trash and debris has been removed. The outlet control structure is clean and maintained, so water can come in and clear out within that 24 to 48 hours after a rain event. And basically, they can come out and even you know, someone from the community walking by can go, all right, nice, dry. It's not holding a bunch of water. You know, things should be working good. We're good to go. You know, you come out and there's 4 feet of water here. Now we have an issue. It's easy to see and kind of do a roadway or window inspection of the facility. So having it look like this is how they're supposed to look like when they're properly maintained. Next slide, please. The inspection process obviously is just not about vegetation. It inspects things across the board. So, you know, one of the big things is the OCS. You'll hear that term a lot. Me use that a lot in this talk even. It stands for outlet control structure. Basically, that's the nuts and bolts of your stormwater pond, or really any stormwater control will have an OCS, because basically we're backing up water or retaining water to a certain extent on a property and releasing it at a controlled rate. And you need some type of structure to be able to do that. So they will inspect those as well, make sure they're functioning. Next slide, please. Sediment's a big one. You know, unfortunately, this is a picture of an underground one. The only way to get this out from an underground one is to vacuum it out with a vacuum truck. Expensive. You're dealing with confined space stuff, but if anybody's had a surface pond, just even a natural neighborhood pond, they can tell you sediment's one of the big cost items. There's no real cheap way to get this out, and once you get it dug out, nobody wants it. So you got to pay for disposal and stuff like that. So that's a big one to keep an eye on. I always tell new HOA communities or property managers that are taking over a community from the developer, this is one of the biggest ones. You want to have an inspection of those stormwater ponds before you sign off from the developer and go, yep, we're taking control of this community, because a lot of times that stormwater pond is serving as their sediment pond while they're building the neighborhood. And if they haven't cleaned it out, as soon as you sign off on it, now it's become your responsibility. You know, we can try to go back and get them to help, but good luck with that, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Don't forget erosion issues. Erosion issues, this is actually a spillway. A lot of times it will just be vegetation coverage on the banks. If the banks and slopes are eroding, they're either contributing sediment into your pond, or they're contributing sediment off-site downstream of your pond. Unfortunately, you're responsible for that sediment, so taking care of just minor erosion issues is definitely something you want to stay on top of. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, we live in an urban society. This is one of the big things, even in our normal lake management duties that our guys deal with on a day-to-day basis. Stormwater features, especially your surface ponds or retention ponds, think of it as a bathtub. Everything that flows into there stays in there. The water can go out, but so everything that goes down the drain gets caught in the pond, and a lot of times that's just bulk floatable trash and man-made trash. Next slide, please. So you've had your inspection. Hopefully, you got an inspection from the county and they've already listed it out. But even from a private consultant, now you've got a list of whether it be routine maintenance issues or immediate maintenance and repair issues that need to be taken care of. In the case of this one, that again came from Gwinnett County, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different issues that they've listed that they need to have done to bring this pond back up to compliance. I can tell you just from discussions with property managers or HOA presidents, pretty overwhelming. You just, where do we start? This is a long list, and we don't have an endless open checkbook. So our recommendation, next slide, please. At the bare bones, if you do nothing else with anything stormwater related, water comes in, water has to go out. So maintaining your spillway or outlet control structure is by far the number one. Do not ignore, do not pass go. I mean, you can't let this go, because water will find a way. If you allow things to get clogged up and water can't get out of that outlet control structure, something's going to go bad. It may not be today, may not be tomorrow, but it's going to happen because that water has to get out somewhere. There's all kinds of different outlet control structures. They can be, corrugated metal pipes. You see a lot more concrete now because it lasts a little bit longer. You'll see PVC and, poly extruded pipe that they're using now, which also lasts longer. But we still see a lot of corrugated metal pipe too, because it's also the cheapest option. But maintaining those spillways is critical. Key one, start there. If it's clogged up and they tell you it's holding water, we got to get the water out. Next slide, please. So here's a good example there. You can't even see the outlet control structure. There's so much debris stopped up on top of this outlet control structure. You can't even see it. So it's hindering water getting out. Next slide, please. This is the debris screen from that same structure. It normally is a nice, perfectly cone-shaped metal structure. I can tell you, because we've installed these structures, they're not cheap. But if we go back to our high school science class, a gallon of water is roughly 8.5 pounds. Most of your ponds, if when in the water industry, we deal with acre feet. So a foot of water over an acre, or that would, or 2 feet over a half acre is an acre foot. An acre foot of water is 326,000 gallons of water. So you multiply that by 8.5, you could think of the weight. If you just have a foot extra of water on top of that outlet control structure because it's clogged up, the amount of weight and pressure that is placed on that system by simply just not maintaining it correctly is, like I said, water finds a way and it will find the weak spots. Next slide, please. Just another example. This is one we got a call from this pond. We actually have started maintaining this one on a regular basis. This is in downtown Atlanta. They couldn't understand why the roadway was clogged, or excuse me, not clogged, why the roadway was flooding after every rain event. Next slide, please. Exact same place. You couldn't even see. I mean, this structure is massive. You can tell by the guy standing on it. They snapped this picture after they were done. They couldn't even believe it when they got all the stuff on how big this structure was. You know, no kidding, the roadway was flooded because there's just so much water that wants to come down this way, and it's just simple maintenance. You know, but this was actually an apartment complex that had changed property owners and, you know, over the years, and they didn't even really hardly know that this was there because it just had gotten covered and just gotten forgotten about. Again, that goes back to the importance of having these things inspected at least on a once a year type basis. Next slide, please. Anybody was around the 2009 floods, historic flooding? Ignoring your spillway can be a big liability when roadways are involved. This was one of the pictures where we had to respond in 2009. The upper center, you can kind of see a debris pile there. That's where the spillway is. It found a way through the dam and washed out this roadway. Unfortunately, in this case, this was the neighborhood's road. It was basically in the center of the community. It was a several hundred home community, but you know, they owned the road. I mean, this is a massive expense. Now, luckily, the city stepped up and shouldered a lot of it with them and helped them out. In some places, like City of Roswell, they don't allow dams to be roads anymore because of situations like this. But I mean, you can think of the expense, and all that came down to was not maintaining the spillway. Next slide, please. We get asked a lot with this. You know, we can just leave it flooded, right? I mean, it looks better. This is not the best example, but we have a good before and after on this one. You know, this is supposed to be a detention pond, but you know, when it flooded up with 5 or 6 foot of water, now they've got a, you know, somewhat of an amenity. They'd rather see a pond there than just this, you know, vegetated dry basin that a detention pond would be. But unfortunately, like we said earlier, detention ponds and retention ponds, they're fundamentally different when it comes to the construction of them. I mean, a dry detention pond is only supposed to hold water for 24 to 48 hours. So that means the developer doesn't have to put as much engineering and detail into the dam structure itself because it's really not supposed to hold water for very long, whereas a retention pond is. When you leave them flooded, next slide, please, this is the same place, and this is what happens. Basically, the entire dam catastrophically failed. Water found the way, had to get out, had like where they put a lot of pressure, like Monday, at least up here in Woodstock, we had 4 inches of rain in several hours. I mean, it was just a massive amount of downpour in a short amount of time, and the dam just couldn't take it. I can tell you from experience of having to repair these, fixing this dam when it gets to a situation like this and it fails is very expensive. What a lot of people is not at the forefront though, and think of is all that dam went somewhere. In this case, it went down to their neighbor's pond. So they not only had to pay to fix the dam, they also had to pay to get the sediment out of their neighbor's pond. So almost a double whammy of expenses for something that basically could have been avoided if it just would have maintained the spillway a little bit better. Next slide, please. A lot of people see concrete spillways. We can kind of blaze through this, but even concrete spillways, if they're meant to be dry, you know, they're built a little bit different than the concrete dams that are meant to hold water all the time. And in the case of this one, simply fell over. You're talking a big expense. I mean, concrete's not cheap nowadays, especially the way we're building roads and all that. And even finding it's hard, but repairing something like this is quite costly. Next slide, please. This is a little more common with your concrete detention ponds. Water just goes underneath them. The pressure finally gets, because they don't have to pour the footings as deep for a dry pond, but repairing this after the fact is also difficult. They kind of have to inject concrete and patch it up from that respect. Next slide, please. Spill is not the only thing, but you also got to consider the BMPs. Like anything, like your car, brakes have to be replaced, tires, flush the radiator from time to time. A stormwater features the same way. We got to remove the trash. We got to maintain the vegetation. And, the BMPs or the best management practice of the way it controls the water leaving that site, those have a lifespan as well. So next slide, please. It just takes maintenance from time to time. That's the same structure. They've got fresh rock in. They've removed some of the sediment. They've reinstalled the metal half-round retrofit on it, and now this thing is functioning properly again. Next slide, please. Next thing after we've dealt with the spillway and the BMPs, next thing you want to address is infrastructure issues. A lot of times that's aging pipes. Unfortunately, we still see a lot of corrugated metal pipe. It's the cheapest. I hate to say that, but the cost difference of that versus reinforced concrete pipe is pretty dramatic. So if you can get away with it, but this stuff has a lifespan of, the manufacturers generally say about 25 to 30 years. So older communities, you kind of got to look at these pipes. This stuff can be repaired in place in most cases, but once it fails, a lot of times the only way to fix it is to pull it up, dig it up, and replace it. Next slide, please. A lot of times those failing pipes or leaking stuff, especially like the bottom picture there is an underground, it presents itself, little leaks and stuff over time will end up presenting themselves in sinkholes or soil loss or piping around structures. So addressing those on a periodic basis, a lot of times that's just hydraulic cement that can seal up those leaks, and fixing it early can avoid a big expense later down the road. Next slide, please. Again, sediment. When it comes to volume, you can see in the case, this is a small pond, but it works here to make my point of when this pond is functioning as its stormwater, as it's intended for its stormwater function, it wants to hold a volume of water after a storm event. You can see in the upper left, when it's full of sediment and vegetation, it no longer functions. So water is basically coming in and going straight out, and you have a downstream effect from that. So this is a violation here. And like we said earlier in the talk, sediment's expensive to get rid of. So the more you can periodically maintain getting out small volumes versus cleaning out the entire pond, the better off you are in the long run. Next slide, please. Routine maintenance with vegetation. A lot of times when we get these cleaned up, what we like to tell customers is best case scenario, we would cut them more often, but if at a minimum, cut them twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall, and you'll stay ahead of most of your vegetation issues. Like we saw earlier with the one that was fully grown up, bringing that one back to a maintainable state, getting rid of all the larger trees and woody overgrowth. You can be saying, in some cases, be talking tens of thousands of dollars to cut and chip and haul off that material versus, maybe $1,000 a year every year. If you haven't touched it for 10 years and it costs you $10,000, $15,000 to bring it back to maintainable state, it's just better to maintain it on a regular basis. In a lot of cases, this is not something that necessarily has to be a technical person that can do this. A lot of your landscapers can do this because they're already on site on larger communities. They're out there, once a week addressing other parts. You can add it into their contract to maintain at least the vegetation of mowing these ponds, the surface ponds, and you're ahead of the game. Next slide, please. Again, I got ahead of myself, but you can see this here. Staying ahead of it with routine mowing is a lot cheaper than the renovation. You can see our guys down in there with machinery and chippers and chainsaws, and it's just highly labor intensive to get these things whipped back into shape from a compliance standpoint with the regulatory city and counties the way they want to see them, rather than every year, once a year, twice a year, you're just doing routine maintenance to not let it get to that state. Next slide, please. I hate to say it because I told you they could help you as well. Sometimes our landscapers are our biggest enemy. You've got this stormwater pond. It's an easy way for them to blow leaves into the storm drains, blow leaves into the ponds, dump your crepe myrtle clippings over the fence into the banks of the pond. All this stuff leads to blockages of the pond. So we can educate your landscapers, whether commercial or residential, that these aren't dumping spaces for their landscape debris. The better off you'll be in the end. Next slide, please. Talked earlier, these are becoming pretty prevalent. These are called pre-treatment filters. It's a way of controlling stormwater before it gets to your stormwater control. So this particular one here is a hydrodynamic separator. Basically, the water comes in from your curb gutters, goes in, swirls around, it basically drops out the sediment, drops out your floatable trash, and then nothing but clean stormwater is going to your retention, detention ponds. In a lot of cases, we'll see these in front of bioretention areas as well. So it's a lot easier to clean this than have to clean and renovate the detention pond, let's say. The only problem is a lot of times there's not a lot of education in that. A lot of times these things need annual clearing, just because they're taking the brunt of that trash and debris and urbanization. So you have to clean them, more regular than anything else. When they're not done, a lot of times these are underneath asphalt in the roadways or under your sidewalks and stuff. The ones that don't get maintained and get forgotten about, a lot of times a sinkhole will develop because basically there's so much sediment and trash in there, the water has to find a way and basically starts getting soil loss. Next slide, please. Don't forget safety. That goes all around. This picture here, that's about an 8-foot drop. The picture doesn't do it justice. I know when I was a kid, this would be a magnet for me to go play after school and build forts and do whatever. But from a liability standpoint, hate to say it, but we're a litigious society. Keep the gates locked, fence them if at all possible, and maintain access control to these places. Next slide, please. Special considerations, like I said, there's a whole bunch of other ways of maintaining stormwater other than retention ponds, detention ponds, underground vaults. Basically, they consider this the green industry or low impact development way of handling stormwater. And we're not dealing with all of the stormwater. We're dealing with that first 1-inch runoff. So a lot of times this is practices used inside the perimeter, where you already have urbanization and we're redeveloping a section and we just don't have the space to put in a big underground vault or a surface pond. So we can handle a lot of that with green infrastructure. Next slide, please. Here's a bunch of practices, all from the Atlanta area. You can see like City Hall has a green roof. A big one throughout Atlanta is pervious pavers. Very cool the way they work. I mean, you could go out there with a fire hose and pour it wide open on that pavement there, and it would disappear until the underground section gets full. But they're pretty amazing. The bioswales, rain gardens, bioretention, really neat, and they work really well. Unfortunately, next slide, please. They're kind of harder to find. This is a perfect example. Everything where you see the brownish pavers there, this is down in the City of Atlanta school. That's all pervious pavers. So basically, that is their stormwater practice. It needs to be inspected regularly. What surprises people, as little as we get it here, one of the biggest killers of these practices is when we get snow and ice, because we come out with the gravel, we come out with the salt, and it immediately goes in and clogs these pavers. So you got to get street sweepers and whatnot. But like you see, it just looks like a normal kind of roadway. Unless you're kind of familiar with this, you wouldn't even know it was part of the stormwater infrastructure until things started flooding a little bit. Next slide, please. Bioretention pond. Very similar to a detention pond, other than basically that surface. There's layers of engineered soil under there that will help water infiltrate. There's about 5 to 6 feet of engineered soil on that. Really cool. Kind of like a big rain garden is how those work. Next slide, please. Believe it or not, depending on how you look at them, one of the biggest users of these is Walmart. They've got super Walmarts everywhere, got massive parking lots. You can see these vegetated and bioswales. Unless you knew better, you would never know that that's part of their stormwater infrastructure for those sites. It just looks like landscaping. But that's their way of managing some of that stormwater runoff to meet their requirements from the city and the county. Next slide, please. Again, green roofs and pavers. Again, you can kind of imagine, like it says there, this one's on the 16th floor, which is almost the roof of this building in downtown Atlanta. If you didn't maintain that correctly, kind of think of the bad things that can happen there. I mean, the flooding and damaging to the building. So, but a lot of people would never know that that is actually a stormwater infrastructure and best management practice to control the runoff from their roof to meet their requirements. Next slide, please. With a lot of those, with the green infrastructure, for those of you that have commercial buildings or large commercial sites, you do get LEED credits for having that stuff and having the maintenance records that you're keeping up with it properly and it's functioning properly. You get credits for that. So those of you that are familiar with the LEED process, you get a bit of a bonus to keep up with that stuff. Next slide, please. That's the end. Hope we taught you a little bit something this evening about stormwater and stormwater infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's not flashy. It's not from your communities. It's not the tennis courts. It's not the pool. But unfortunately, by law, it's something that you have to maintain. Like I said, if you get that notice of violation or notice to comply from the city or county, they're willing to work with you. They know that we don't have an endless amount of money with communities to repair and bring these things up to compliance maybe immediately. But on the flip side, we go build a new pool, they're probably not going to be as lenient on that stuff. So again, it's not flashy, but when you're dealing with water, it's really, really important that we maintain these things properly. Hope you learned something. Alyssa?
We've got a couple of questions that are queuing up on the side.
Okay. Let's see. First one I see it says our community has a detention pond and many of our homeowners have drains of some kind in their backyard. Do those drains connect to the detention pond, making the association responsible when a homeowner has a problem? That's a good question. I hate to say it depends because in a lot of cases it does depend. There's not necessarily consistency when it comes to property rights and how things are set up. Ideally, your community was set up to where the green space and all your stormwater infrastructure is an HOA responsibility. We still see a lot of, sometimes older communities, but we still see even new communities where, Mrs. Smith has a stormwater pond in her backyard, and as far as everybody's concerned, it is her responsibility because she owns the property, she owns the entire pond, and it is hers. That's not fun because Mrs. Smith has even less money than the community as a whole, but she also has a vested interest because it's in her backyard to keep it maintained. Those drains, a lot of times those will be drop inlets. Yes, they will lead to the detention pond. More often than not, the HOA is going to work with you, in our experience, to maintain that as opposed to the homeowner doing it. It's a bit of a challenge for them from the management side of it, because a lot of times when those are in people's backyards, they self-maintain or modify them themselves and beautify them and cover them up, and we've seen all manners of way they've been manipulated. So you're kind of a yin and a yang. You're trying to fight it, but ideally, yes, the HOA would handle that. Hope that wasn't too long-winded. Any other questions?
We've got one right here that says, the city of Johns Creek has implemented a stormwater utility program. Because the community has the detention pond and we are responsible for it, would that have any bearing on our community for having to pay the fees from the city?
It depends on each individual community's program. More often than not, we don't see that it is has a bearing on them paying the fee. More often than not, it is if you submit your inspection reports and other check marks that show that the stormwater stuff is being maintained properly and is functioning properly, then as an overall, you gain the credit at the end of the year back, whether that be on the taxes, property taxes, or in some other realm. I don't often see where they waive the fees, but I can see that maybe in some communities that they go with that route. I just haven't seen it often that way. You will get the fee back or as a credit later, but usually they collect that ahead of time.
Okay, our next question is, our subdivision has an underground detention vault. It runs behind 3 homeowners' backyards, covered by a deck, and I believe they followed up to say that it is partially covered. We have recently discovered that there is no concrete bottom to this vault, only dirt. We just had sediment vacuumed out, but there still remains standing water. I should also add that this vault is only partially underground. The outlet dumps into a natural creek. What do you recommend?
If it's still holding water, then I would think that something's happened as far as you're not getting positive drainage to the outlet control structure. That would be my first guess. My second guess would be that, or probably the easiest thing to check would be to check on the downstream end. A lot of times we will see, when I say downstream end, I'm saying downstream of the vault itself. For the water to drain, it has to obviously be able to drain. So in a lot of cases, we've seen where things are clogged up downstream and water's backing up into the outlet control structure, and then it can't drain the basin itself. So those would be the first two things I would check. Just because it has a soil bottom, that's not necessarily a design flaw or anything like that. A lot of times they do that so that you gain a infiltration benefit. Basically, for lack of a better word, it holds the water, those 24 to 48 hours if it's meant to be dry, and infiltrates it into the ground naturally, recharging some of the water table rather than just letting it run off downstream. So there's a lot of, having not seen it, answers of why it could be that way. But you would, if it's holding water, my first step is to find out if it's supposed to or not. We just did inspections on a bunch of ponds here recently, and everybody, including myself, when we first saw them, until we got the design plans, thought that they were supposed to be dry, and they weren't. They were meant to hold water. So having those design plans really help out to make sure that you're not treating a problem that isn't a problem.
Okay, next question we have is for communities that are private, meaning that they're gated or they're responsible for the roads. Does the city or county have jurisdiction to inspect and enforce?
When it comes to stormwater, yeah, the city county has jurisdiction, carte blanche. It doesn't matter if it's a gated community or not. If it's part of your stormwater infrastructure, that's part of the Clean Water Act and Georgia stormwater law. So they can come in and inspect it. They can't just bust in, but I mean, it is their responsibility to make sure that you are maintaining that properly and that it's functioning properly. We, along those lines, to kind of anticipate a follow-up question on that, all of these stormwater ponds will have what they call easements on them. I hate to say it, we would run across it all the time, but we kind of walk a tight line when it comes to stormwater, because we are an environmental company, and when it comes to natural ponds and a lot of our stream restoration work, we're doing natural type restoration of buffers and stuff. But when it comes to stormwater ponds, for them to function properly, a lot of times we got to cut down the vegetation. We run across it all the time where, property owners are like, well, that's in my backyard and I like all the trees and you're not touching a single one of them. And in fact, I'm calling my lawyer and the cops, you're not allowed to go back there. The easements say otherwise. So basically, and when you take over these new communities, you sign into a memorandum of agreement with the county that you're going to maintain them. They're going to hold you accountable and inspect and make sure you are maintaining them, and they have access to go back there and do their inspections.
All right, it looks like we've got two more questions.
Okay.
And this next question is definitely one of my favorites. As a community manager, I definitely get this question a lot. I'm so glad that this person asked, how close can trees be planted to a detention pond? Is there a scenario where some trees can be in the detention pond area? That's a fantastic question.
There are. I hate to say again that it depends, but it does. And I'll preface that with not to get into political or any type of discussion there, but we have stormwater laws. What they call the local issuing authority, whether the city or county is responsible for enforcing and maintaining those laws, which means they have their own interpretation of what those laws mean and what those laws say. So where you may have, say, Gwinnett County, and I'm not calling out any, they want every single tree gone out of the pond, and the next county over, that stormwater department and inspectors, they're okay with having trees in there. So it kind of depends in those respects. I will say from a maintenance standpoint, on any pond, whether it's a stormwater pond, natural pond, or whatever, trees and dams don't mix. So I don't like to ever see trees, shrubs, any woody type of vegetation that is going to have kind of a deep penetrating root structure be placed on the dam. Along those lines, we don't like to see any trees or woody vegetation within 15 feet of concrete structures, whether it be an inlet head wall, whether it be the OCS, or whether it be the outfall on the backside of the dam. We just visited one this week, surprisingly enough, where the tree grew around the head wall, and in last week's storms, the tree got blown over and ripped the entire head wall and pipe out. So keeping that woody vegetation, those roots love growing to water, keeping them at least 15 feet away from structures. We do see where communities will get approved to landscape, and we've seen in some cases where they have like a little dog park or walking trail that encompasses the detention pond basin. Those are great when they stay maintained. It's something that needs to be approved. Just coming in and landscaping it and it looks great. Unfortunately, if the issuing authority is not on board with it, they can make you rip it all back out. I hate to say that, but they could. We see a lot of those though, where they plant a bunch of nice trees or shrubs and maintain it. The board switches over, and within 5 years, it's overgrown and looks bad, and you're having to pay somebody to come in and cut it all down and get it back to shape. So I hope that answered your question. I can't stress enough though, at least if nothing else, don't plant trees and stuff on the dam. It's just bad news.
All right, thank you so much. And it looks like this is our last question. We get this question a lot as well. Can my neighbor call the county to report my association's pond status?
Yeah. I mean, anybody can call the county and express that they don't think, say that something's flooding and they don't think that something's being maintained properly. We see it happen quite often, actually. So yeah, they can. To be honest, our crews get the county called on them quite often once we go in there and start, cutting down stuff and maintaining them. People think that we're doing something wrong a lot of times when, we're complying with them. So yeah, anybody can call it. Along those lines, I would say, when it comes back to the inspection stuff, the county or the city and the county, or the local issuing authority, as we call them, is responsible at, on some interval, like I said earlier, sometimes that is a 5-year rotation for inspecting your pond. That being said, we don't necessarily out of the gates tell a community or a property manager, call the county and have them come out and look at it and see what they say. I hate to say that, but basically once you do that, now you're on the record. They're not going to come out and, crack the whip and go, all right, you got to spend $100,000 next week type of thing. But still, you're on the record. They've come out there, they're going to document it. They're going to do their job. So that's where, in a lot of cases, a private consultant or a private firm like us at Aquascape, have them come out and get their opinion on it, whether you're doing a paid inspection or they just come out and kind of have a look, see, and yeah, it's a problem. Because that way, if the county eventually has to get involved or comes out for their inspection, now you've got documentation to say, hey, we're doing our due diligence. We're aware that we have an issue and we're working towards resolving that issue. And in most cases, when you can show that, it's been our experience, the county kind of says, great, we're not going to, put our thumb down on you and, mandate that you have to have it done by this time. You could say, all right, well, this year we're clearing the pond. Next year, we're going to repair this. The following year, we plan to do that. And as long as you have a plan and a process, they're a lot more willing to work with you on that rather than the community that just ignores it and waits until the city or county comes out and says, whoa, now you got a problem, and you got to do something. Hope that answers the question. Melissa, you might be muted. Oh, there you go.
Yes, I was. Fun technical difficulties and human error. But yes, thank you so much. Your questions and your answers were excellent. I do want to let all of you know that we have approached our time, and we thank you so much for staying with us. There have been a few more questions that have been submitted, so do not fret. We will go ahead and get those questions answered for you in writing and attach them to the recording that you will all receive tomorrow. So on behalf of Heritage University, we really, really do wish to thank Aquascape Environmental and Paul for his time today, and we look forward to seeing all of you again next time.